One man's death has provoked a movement for change. What began with the killing of George Floyd is now a global moment of reckoning, with pressure to confront racism once and for all. Tonight on Sky News, we focus on race and revolution and ask, is change going to come? Good evening, I'm Gillian Joseph. Over the next hour, we'll discuss how the debate around racism is changing and what more needs to be done. Joining us, the Hollywood actor David Oyelowo, whose credits include the role of Martin Luther King in Selma. With questions being raised around the lack of diversity at senior levels across society, we're joined by one of the UK's leading advertising executives and senior government advisor, Karen Blackett. Plus the historian and award-winning filmmaker, Professor David Olusoga. And completing our quartet, the former government minister and first black Conservative MP to attend the cabinet, Sam Gyimah. Facing them, a live virtual studio audience who'll be asking questions about how racism can be driven from society. So statues have fallen, thousands have protested, millions have joined a new conversation, all prompted by the killing and those desperate dying breaths of George Floyd.
I can't breathe, man. Please.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Don't shoot.
You will not silence us.
You have to dominate. You don't dominate. You're wasting your time.
Oh boy. Oh boy.
Black Lives Matter.
We're not here to hurt you at all.
You okay?
Oh my God!
I didn't want the narrative to change to something ugly.
Why would I walk past that every day? Makes me feel like I don't matter.
Enough is enough.
We're just striving for equality. I'd love for there to be a change.
It didn't happen in London, but it could happen in London. It has happened in London.
What do we want? Justice!
We want to see 4 officers prosecuted and sentenced.
We think that because we're not as openly racist as America is, that we are innocent. We are not.
No more hate crimes, please. When has America ever been great?
Hopefully George is looking down right now and saying there's a great thing that's happening for our country.
Justice for peace! Justice for peace!
Please let the future not be the same for my son as it has been for my dad.
George Floyd's life mattered. Breonna Taylor's life mattered. Rolando Castillo's life mattered.
This is how small problems become big problems.
Every single day I have to wake up and learn a new name.
You're a black kid, you're a target.
Enough is enough!
Really not sure what else America needs to see.
Really kind of opens up a conversation.
It's not just in America, this is global.
We should have the same opportunities, the same rights. We're all human.
Time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks.
The passionate words of Reverend Al Sharpton there, conveying the determination that this time things are going to change. But tragically, George Floyd's name joins an ever-growing list of black men whose killings were supposed to usher in a new era of racial equality in America especially. 8 years ago, that name was Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old from Florida shot as he walked home and whose death became a focal point for anti-racism campaigners across the United States. Trayvon's mother, Sabrina Fulton, joins us live now from Miami. Welcome to you. It's hard to believe that it's already 8 years since Trayvon's killing. How are you?
I'm doing well. I can actually say I'm really doing well. I've been staying home because of the coronavirus, but I'm doing fairly well.
How did you feel when you saw those images that have been played out across our screens of George Floyd being killed?
It's heartbreaking. It's disgusting to know that we're still being treated like animals, like we're 3/5 human. And it was awful. It was awful to hear George seeing what happened to him, such disrespect, and to know that he was calling out for his mom, who was already in heaven.
And what sort of memories did it bring back for you?
It brought memories back of my son and the tragic, death that he had, and just to know that so many people are supporting George Floyd, and I stand with him as well. I stand with his family as well, just so I can do my part to, just make sure that my voice is heard. I definitely feel like change is going to come. That was one of the things that I heard in the clip that you just played. Most definitely change is going to come, but we have to keep the pressure on, and we to make sure that we have laws in place and make sure that we make the necessary changes so people don't continue to treat us a certain way.
And talking about keeping that pressure on, a year after Trayvon was killed, the Black Lives Matter movement was set up, and you've started the Trayvon Martin Foundation. Do you think that group action makes a difference?
I absolutely do. I absolutely think that united we stand. I absolutely think that, the voice of so many different people from all walks of life. It doesn't matter if you're poor, middle class, or rich, if you're educated or uneducated. It doesn't matter if you're Christian, Baptist, Muslim, a Jewish. It doesn't matter those things. It doesn't matter if you're straight or gay. Those things are not are important. What's important is that these are human beings, that we all are human beings, and we should treat each other accordingly. We should treat each other and respect each other, no matter what your religion is, no matter what the color of your skin is.
As we know, the debate around criminal justice continues today. We've had Donald Trump, the president of the United States, signing an executive order restricting police use of chokeholds. Do you welcome that? Has that gone far enough for you?
It was one part in there that he said that had me concerned. It said unless it was necessary or they feared for their life. If we have had people being shot in the back, and I don't understand, some of the things, some of the language that law enforcement uses, and some of the language that even the president used today. It could be questionable, but I just think that people need to stop killing us for no reason. If whatever George Floyd did, he should have been arrested for it, and it should not have cost him his life.
You attended the funeral of George Floyd. Obviously, you witnessed the grief, the loss, and the anger. Do you think that his killing is a tipping point? Is something different this time?
The difference I see now is a lot of young people are involved, and that's a plus. A lot of people from all walks of life are involved, and it was recorded on video. So the narrative would have been a little differently had we not had a video. We would have heard that George Floyd resisted arrest, or that he was belligerent or something like that, and the officer feared for his life. But that's not what we saw. Because of the video, we were able to see that he was handcuffed, he was on the ground, his face was pressing the ground, he was calling out that he couldn't breathe, he was calling out for his mother while he was being restrained by 3 officers, and the 4th officer was standing there. And so all parties involved need to be held accountable, regardless. Whenever there's a loss of life, they need to be held accountable.
Sabrina Fulton, thank you very much for speaking to us this evening. Well, maybe there is a difference this time, and the global reaction to the killing of George Floyd, including, of course, in the UK, will finally provide a catalyst for change. So lots to discuss with our panel then. So let's get our first question from our virtual audience. First up is Yasmin Omotosho from Buckhurst Hill in Essex. What is your question, Yasmin?
Good evening. Through my work as a barrister, I often find that black men are disproportionately targeted by the police and are more likely to have force used against them by police officers. This has fatally damaged community-police relations and caused many within black communities to distrust the police. What are the practical ways the police can establish trust with black communities in the UK?
And Yasmin, you've come into this area from your daily experiences through your profession, is that right?
I have, yes.
OK, let's take that to the panel, that question from Yasmin. If we go to Sam Gyimah, first of all. Sam, Yasmin saying that disproportionately black people are disserved by the criminal justice system.
There is a lot in that, and not just in terms of community policing, but certainly if you look at incarceration rates and the number of black men specifically in prison and black youths, it is very high. And I think she asked about specific things that could be done. Policing works when it is by consent and when the police work hand in glove with the community rather than against the community. And I think that's what we need to focus on, more community policing, but specifically around things like stop and search, where there were reforms several years ago to basically stop the police just stopping anyone and searching them, which sort of led to some of the harassment that I think Yasmin is referring to. And I think most senior policemen agree that there are ways of dealing with things like stop and search without necessarily going to the lengths that some policemen do and therefore harassing young men. I think that is it. But the big point you made in your program is this is yet another watershed in racial injustice. And we don't want there to be another one. We need reform, and we need reform across the board now.
Karen Blackett, how can police establish trust with the black community here in the UK?
But there is a formula which is in the book, The Trusted Advisor, that talks about trust equals credibility plus reliability plus empathy divided by self-orientation. So I think the core thing that we need to see more of is that empathy. And I think it's exactly what has just been said in terms of actually understanding your audience, understanding the fruit salad that is modern Britain. Having more of a connection helps build empathy. I mean, the stats speak for themselves. As your audience member has said, 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched, 5 times more likely to be arrested, 3 times more likely to have force used on them when arrested. So I generally think there is a disconnect between the police and some communities, and you help build trust by having greater empathy. And it's going back to that trust equation for me.
David Oyelowo, how do you build that empathy that Karen's talking about?
Well, I think that there are a lot of things one can do in the immediate, obviously, but, I think of this in a more long-term sense. What we are dealing with in terms of racism in the UK, in America and across the world is tied to systems of oppression that have existed for centuries. A lot of the problem is education. I think you have Britain as a country, in my opinion, that has done a terrible job of educating the young, educating the society in terms of who Black people actually are and who we have been historically, the legacy of colonialism, Britain's participation in the enslavement of Black people. And if you are able to really start to break down what these systems of oppression have been over centuries and the discrepancy between who we actually are as Black and brown people and who we are perceived to be, I think a breaking down of those preconceptions are what are going to eventually, with time, mean that we have a more equitable society. Because a lot of the time what you're dealing with is, when it comes to the police, is them dealing with their notion of who we are as Black and brown people, as opposed to who we actually are. And that ties back to education. So even though there is policy that can come in at this time, I think a more long-term view needs to be taken in terms of changing the perception of who we are as Black and brown people who are participating rightfully in British life.
You mentioned their education. We're going to be speaking a little bit more about that later on in the programme. But you've spoken very passionately about this subject, and you shared some of your feelings. I hope you don't mind us showing a clip of what you posted on social media, David.
I'm just recording this, having just watched George Floyd's funeral, where everyone was asked to be silent for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and that is such a long time. That is such a long time to have a man's knee on your neck. Oh, please let the future not be the same for my son as it has been for my dad, for me, and for so many black people over the centuries.
That's actually really difficult to watch, David, and those in the studio audience affected by that. But you get a real sense of how deeply felt this is for you.
Well, when I talk there about the long time, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, there was so much about Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck that was symbolic of what we as black people have had to endure for centuries. Whether it's the enslavement of black people, whether it's the colonization of so much of Africa and what we still endure now in modern life, and how long we have been begging, pleading, imploring that we be seen as fully human. There is this phrase that has crept into our parlance now, which is gaslighting. You are made to feel insane as a black person by calling out these things. And one of the jewels in the crown when it comes to systems of oppression is making the oppressed feel like they are lying, feel like they are complaining, feel like they have a narrative in their head that doesn't correlate with reality. It's what happens to people who are enduring domestic abuse. The abuser convinces them that they are exaggerating. It's what we have done traditionally to women who have been raped. Even in the judicial system, we have made it so that they don't feel able to cry out because we distrust them on the basis of the evidence that they are giving, that they are being harmed. And this has been the case for black and brown people for so long. And in the UK particularly, talking about racism, you are made to feel like you're playing the race card. It's not something that truly exists. And it's because so much of Britain's bad behavior has taken place on other continents, in Africa, in America. But Britain did a pretty incredible job of building and perfecting those systems before farming them out to the world.
And Yasmin nodding her head in agreement there. Also, Professor Olusoga, saw you nodding your head also.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can discuss this without discussing history. I mean, there's a reason why we have a particular problem in this country with the police, and that's because the police has its own history of, for example, sending officers to the dying empire in the 50s and 60s who came back with their ideas, its own history of being involved in the investigations and the drawing up of reports in the 1950s, again, investigations into the black community, investigations to try to prove the case against the black community and therefore the case for racial immigration laws. The police have a very specific problem in Britain, which in some ways is just a microcosm of the bigger problem, which is that black people are treated with suspicion. Black people's backstories are not told. And that history has created a culture which is at odds with many aspects of the rest of the country. What black people experience when they're stopped by the police, when they encounter the criminal justice system, is people who don't see them as individuals, a system that can't see them as individuals. And to encounter that situation, and to realize that no matter what you've done or who you are or what you've achieved, none of that matters because you're not you. You are what they perceive you to be. That is almost uniquely damaging.
OK, at that point, I want to bring Yasmin back in. Yasmin, do you think, from what we've heard from the panel there, that there's a realistic prospect of the police building a new relationship, if you like, with the black community?
Well, firstly, the answers are just so terrific. And I think there needs to be an acknowledgement, first and foremost, that there is an issue. And there doesn't appear to have been that yet. So that needs to be the starting point. And only then can empathy even be gauged at all. There's hope, but from this point, I'm not entirely sure, unfortunately. OK, Yasmin, hopeful there. Well, let's have a look at some of the statistics for you, shall we? Because they make up some pretty stark reading. Black people make up around 3% of the population, but 13% of the prison population. Last year, black people were more than 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people. But at the other end of the criminal justice system, just 1% of court judges in England and Wales are black. So just 1% of judges in the criminal justice system are black. Sam Gyimah, do those stats shock you?
They don't, because this is a story that we've all been aware of for a very long time. That, you know, whether it's not just in the criminal justice system, whether it's journalism, whether it's academia, whether it's the civil service, certainly in terms of those who are at the top, they're very consistent with the criminal justice system. What is shocking is we're still talking about this in 2020. What is shocking is after several reviews, you know, I think there was the Lamy review into the criminal justice system, which was the last one, we still don't feel confident that we're anywhere close to actually addressing this issue. And that there were some people I know who reacted to George Floyd's tragic death by saying, well, that's an American issue. It's not an issue for Britain. We are different. We don't have the same problems here, but we do have our own problems. We do have a shadow side to our history and to what is going on currently. And so to your question, is it shocking? No, it's not. But what's remarkable is that it's not shocking because we've all known this for a very long time.
Karen Blackett.
Look, I was brought up a child of the 70s in Reading, and my mum and dad came to the UK in 1961. My mum was a nurse, my dad electrical engineer and worked for BT, and they had 2 daughters, myself and my sister, and I was told from a very early age you have to try twice as hard to get half as much, that things are stacked against you. You're a woman and you're a black woman. So the statistics don't surprise me. When I think of my world and the world of business and the advertising community, we are responsible and help shape culture. We help shape what is seen as the cultural norms. And if I think about my industry, less than 5% of the leaders and the CEOs of the advertising industry in the UK come from a black or minority ethnic background. So if our job is to portray consumer stories as part of a brand story, there's not enough diversity to be able to portray those stories in a real way and in an authentic way. So the statistics don't shock me. I am stato, so I tend to look a lot at data, and I can see it from my own industry, which is a microcosm of what's going on in this country and what's going on globally. The way of being able to get to the top, to remove barriers, to be in those senior roles is stacked against us. It really is, because people tend to hire in their own mirror image. It's no coincidence that there's just 4 black CEOs in the Fortune 500 and there's 1 black FTSE 100 CEO. That says it all.
Yeah, you bring in some more unfavourable stats and lots of agreement from our audience there. I'd like to bring in another audience member now, Sarita Harewood, who has a story that I suspect is pertinent to a lot of black people. Sarita, what's your experience?
So basically, I'm also from Reading, so hello. Myself and my daughter went along to a well-known retailer not so long ago, and we were watched as soon as we walked in the door, all the way through, when we were stopping to look at things, when we were even paying, all the way through to when we walked out the door. It makes you feel like a criminal, even though you know that you're not. And the worst thing was, previously I'd gone in dressed in work attire and hadn't been looked at all. But it's that presumption, it's the fact that my daughter and myself have to go through that on a daily basis. And I find it shocking and sad.
Sarita, thank you for sharing your experience with us. David Oyelowo, the everyday experiences that black people have to go through are now coming to the fore. Can you share yours with us?
Well, in line with what Karen just said about her industry, my industry is disgraceful, shameful, shocking, statistically speaking, when it comes to the representation of black people. And it is doubly insidious because a lot of how the world imbibes culture, has a notion of what the world is through television and film and entertainment generally. So, you know, what the lady just said there about her experience may be shocking to some, but the unfortunate thing is that it's not shocking to a black person. The thing that I keep going back to is systems of oppression. We are in the midst of, someone described it to me the other day, that we are born into a racist container in the West. We are born into something that is not necessarily who we are, but how we are and what we do and what we think is dictated by that racist container we are born into. And it is designed. The thing that I really want people, and especially white people, to understand, white people who balk at the notion of white supremacy and white privilege as terminology that has now crept into society, they need to just come to terms with the fact that there is design in this. What that lady had in that store is tantamount to what happens in a police state. That is what enabled apartheid to be rife for so long. It is the line you can draw between the slave catchers, when black people were enslaved in America, to the sharecroppers who had slave catchers there, who were literally from slavery to sharecropping to the prison industrial complex. Policing and a police state and how black people have been policed, there is a direct line. And as black people in the world, we experience either heavy-handed versions of that or mild versions of that. And it is all tied to perpetuating the notion of white supremacy, which is tied to power, which is tied to a certain demographic in the world retaining that power. And so every time you go into a store and you are watched, somehow you are in the cog of this wheel that is making you feel like you are lesser than. And Britain, we all sort of talk about the class system, the upper class, the middle class, the working class. That is a system of oppression to keep people in their place. When you look at the Grenfell Tower and you see that nearly half of the people who died in that tragedy were black and brown people, it is not a mistake. We are dealing with something that is by design. And until that design, until those structures, until those mechanisms are dismantled and rebuilt, I don't know how we move forward, because reform tends to be a band-aid on a bullet wound. That's why I keep on going back to education.
I don't know if you can see, David, but applause from our studio audience who've been listening to what you've had to say. And we're going to see now how widespread these issues are and how they differ for white and black people. I want to do a bit of an experiment. So I'm going to ask everyone in the audience and our panellists as well to put your hand up in front of your face so that we can see the palm of your hand. Have you all done that? OK, so now I'm going to ask a series of questions and I want you to put a finger down each time. OK, let's go for it. First question, put a finger down if you've been called a racial slur or have been racially abused. OK, finger down if you've been given or have given the coming of age talk about how to behave when stopped by the police. Put a finger down if you've been stopped by police for no valid reason. Put a finger down if someone has assumed you are the cleaner or driver. Put a finger down if someone has expressed surprise at how articulate you are. Put a finger down if you've been asked, where are you really from? So nearly all the black fists are clenched, no fingers left. And I think almost all the white hands still remaining with all fingers. And on our panel, I see that Karen has one finger, the only one with one finger raised there. Karen, are you surprised by the visual representation of our audience there? That clearly showed perhaps what we have come to know and is common parlance now as white privilege.
I'm not surprised at all, and that doesn't mean that I don't believe that there are some brilliant allies that exist, but I am not surprised because it's not their lives, it's not something that they've experienced. And what I have seen over the last few weeks since the killing of George Floyd is actually more allies trying to understand. So I agree with David's point about education, and it's education for everyone. I can't be responsible for educating everybody that has exhibited and has benefited from white privilege. You've got to educate yourself as well. So it's not a surprise, unfortunately. I think maybe compared to the other panelists as a black female, some of the questions that you've asked, I haven't experienced all of them. But the fact that, you know, most of the panel had all of their fingers down, it's no surprise. Same with our studio audience.
Yeah, important that you made that distinction about being a black woman. The experiences of black women and men are quite different. Let's take a question from our audience now, this time from Ben Shonaby. Ben, what's your question?
Hi, good evening. So my question is quite simple. Why is it difficult for some people to see statues of men brought down when their wealth was built on the backs of slaves?
Ben, before I put that question to the panel, what's your view of this argument that's raging now over statues?
So, first of all, I don't believe in vandalism. It's not good to vandalize anything. But when it comes to the point of statues, we have to look at the historical value of those statues. We need to know, and Britain as a country needs to understand what those statues represent, because they will represent different things to different people. What we're actually seeing now is that where statues and things were the one that's happened quite recently, we're taking a view of what that actually is. And they've gone through the means and ways of trying to rectify and see what that actually was in the statue, but it didn't take course. So now we're having to take it down, and the people are actually rising up to actually take action into their own hands.
OK, Ben, thank you for that. So a reminder of Ben's question, why is it difficult for some people to see statues of men brought down when their wealth was built on the backs of slaves? Professor Olusoga, I think this one is for you, a Bristolian. Let us know, first of all, what your thoughts were when you saw that statue of Edward Colston brought down.
Well, I was sad that it came to that. It should never have come to that, because there have been decades and decades of attempts to persuade the council in this city, and I'm talking to you from Bristol, to remove that statue. this is a city that's 14% non-white. It's about, I think, 6% African Caribbean. That means all of those subjects of this city, who are the descendants of enslaved people, have been asked for decades to live their lives under the gaze of somebody who enslaved, we estimate, around 80,000 people, and we estimate about 19,000 of them died in the Middle Passage. To ask people to tolerate that, to swallow the pain it causes them, is a profound act of disrespect. So while I don't condone the pulling down of statues, I will not condemn those who took part in it, because every possible alternative was rebuffed and ignored. And I think that's because the people in power in the city were convinced that this would never happen. And they were wrong. What's happening today in Bristol is quite incredible. The memorials, the mentions, the way in which Edward Colston, the slave trader, his name was imprinted in this city, his image appearing in the stained glass windows of two of the city's churches, his name on buildings, on a concert hall, all of that in the space of about 48 hours has been wiped away. I've lived in this city 22 years, and I've been told that was impossible. The city would never turn its back on the great philanthropist. They would never remember his role in the Atlantic slave trade. They'd only remember his philanthropy. It's all happened in about 48 hours. It's gone.
Remarkable. Let's listen to the words, or actually read you the words of the Prime Minister on this subject, something he's had a lot to say about. It's not just that it's wrong to destroy public property by violence. I'm also extremely dubious about the growing campaign to edit or Photoshop the entire cultural landscape. If we start purging the record and removing the images of all but those whose attitudes conform to our own, we're engaged in a great lie, a distortion of our history. Sam Gyimah, is it a distortion of our history if we aim to bring down statues of previous slavers?
I think the first thing I'll say is I absolutely agree with what was done in Bristol, because there had been several attempts to get rid of that statue through democratic processes.
So you think they were right to bring the statue down in the manner that they did?
I think vandalism, no, but I can totally understand why they did it. And but what I think, going back to what I said earlier, is we've got to be able to discuss our history, warts and all. And that means being comfortable at the dark side of empire, as well as all the other aspects of it. And in the absence of doing that, you get the situation where there is frustration about statues and people wanting to express that frustration and that anger through pulling down statues. My own view, though, is that if we are to deal with the issues of racial injustice in our society today and the future, arguing over which 19th century statue we keep doesn't get us closer to solving the problems in the criminal justice system, doesn't get us closer to addressing the deep inequalities in education, doesn't get us closer to enabling people to fulfill their potential if they are in work, which is the case for a lot of Black and brown people. They don't. They're either not in work, or if they're in work, not many of them fulfill their potential. So yes, we should discuss our history, we should discuss the dark side of it, and we should hang it all out there. But in terms of where I would put my efforts for today and the future, and certainly when I think about my own mixed race children, is to make sure that they don't have to go through what I went through. I've been extremely fortunate. But when I got into politics, it was very clearly explained to me, you don't want to be the Black politician. And I didn't want to be either. I wanted to be the politician who happened to be Black. And, you know, you talked about experiences of racism. I experienced a lot of it, but I had to treat a lot of it as the cost of doing business. And the more painful side of things, the more hurtful side of things, I didn't confront. You know, I learned to smile, to deflect from them. I learned to just walk away. I don't want my children to grow up in a world that is like that.
So
and that means addressing the problems we face today.
You learned to be the smiling Black politician. David Oyelowo, you wanted to come in there. I saw you raise your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on what Sam just said there. Yes, taking down those statues doesn't necessarily move the needle when it comes to the criminal justice system. But like I said earlier, it's about dismantling systems of oppression. What the Prime Minister said there about the distortion of history, Great Britain, no country has done this better when it comes to the distortion of history, when it comes to the fact that Great Britain, as it stands today, was built on the backs of Black people, was built on the backs of the resources it pillaged from Africa. With colonialism being the blanket excuse and us pledging allegiance to Great Britain, and we built modern day Britain. And so the notion that when Brexit hits, people are telling my brother, go back to where you came from, when it was built on the backs of our ancestors, that's a distortion of history. That's something that people are not talking about. We're not talking about the fact that Great Britain, as a country that has limited resources, built itself to Great Britain on the backs of Indians, of Africans, and all of the other colonies that it had. That's a distortion of history, a much more egregious distortion of history than the notion of taking down statues that should never have been there in the first place on the basis of what Britain says it wants to be and who it is. The fact of the matter is, this is about, going forward, who do we want to be? What do we want to be? How do we want the next generation to perceive the country we are? We can't say things and then demonstrate it differently by what we celebrate. We can't celebrate that and then expect them to be different when they're walking past it every day. It must be torn down. It must be.
Professor Olusoga, I know you want to come in there, but I do want to go back to our audience and I want to see what they think of this, actually. We just want to do a straw poll by way of a show of hands. Audience, do you think that statues of anyone who's expressed racist views, whatever they've achieved in life, should be taken down? Hands up if you think that should be the case. Almost all of you, 75 to 80% of you, hands up there, agreeing that statues of previous slavers should be brought down. Thank you for that straw poll. Well, let's move on to another question now from our audience, and this comes from Ruth Ibegbuna from West Yorkshire. Ruth, what's your question?
Good evening, everyone. It links very much to what's been discussed. Why won't the UK's national curriculum educate its pupils as to the full facts of the UK's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and also the British Empire? Why don't we allow our students to think critically about the past in order to forge a better future?
Professor Olusoga.
I think it's because history performs a different and I think very worrying function in Britain compared to other countries. We don't use our history to ask questions about how our nation came to be what it is. We don't use history as a vehicle to ask ourselves why Britain rose to power. We use history to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. History is a place we go for recreation, not to ask difficult questions. And what that means is if history is a place of comfort, you need to remove from it all of the facts, all of the episodes that are uncomfortable, that are discomforting. And that means the history of empire, it means the history of the Atlantic slave trade, it means the history of the horrific violence that undercut empire, it means the removal of the fact that Britain was running concentration camps in Kenya within living memory. All of that gets in the way of history being a place of comfort. And of course, those stories are the stories that explain how people like myself and many people in the audience came to be here. They're the bits of the history that explain how Britain is seen by billions of people across the world. And also, they are the most important bits of history that everybody needs to hear, because we need to hear these hard truths. We've convinced ourselves that we are the only nation in the whole of history who's only ever done good. And we honestly believe that. And people get hurt when you suggest Britain, like every other country ever, has done some good things and some bad things. We've come to believe in a fairy tale, and we call it history.
Karen Blackett, saw you nodding there. Do you recall the history you were taught at school?
Look, I have a 10-year-old who's in year 5, and you know, we've had a lot of debate over the last couple of weeks about what's happened in the US, and then talked about, you know, our history in the UK. And, you know, there's always World Book Day, and there's always lots of events which sort of celebrate moments in history. And I actually brought my son a book about Windrush, because it's an area that he's not taught. And it's an area where, you know, my mum and dad followed the Windrush generation, and the influence of the Caribbean on the UK, it's not discussed and it's not taught. And it's a part of history that I'd like my son to know about, to understand the contribution of his granddad and grandma and the people that came before him to UK history. He's taught about American history, which is great, because global awareness is good, but we're not taught about the UK at school. So it's something that's very real, which is why I was nodding, because it's been based on discussions that we've had over the last couple of weeks, very real, very live discussions about understanding how we're here and understanding how we're viewed, and unfortunately having the conversation that not everyone will see him as equal to them.
And the word Windrush only coming into public consciousness in the last couple of years or so. Well, let's stay with education. We've got a teacher in the audience, just starting out, in fact, Kim Lauren. What's your perception of the curriculum as it stands now?
Well, as a student teacher of art design in secondary education, I would just like to say that many of us are committed to social justice. And that's why I'm here today. So in light of the issues highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement, I feel that now we need support more than ever to review and deliver a much more progressive curriculum which reflects our multicultural Britain today.
Kim, thank you. Sam Gyimah, we need to go back to basics and start with education, start at the beginning.
Well, that's absolutely true. The way in which you change people's minds fundamentally is by how you educate them and what you expose them to. And that is all aspects of our curriculum. I think when I look at what happens, for example, every year there is the UN Day against discrimination. And most organizations, most schools will probably do something on that day and then move on. But Britain is a multicultural country now. If you take the arrival of the Windrush in 1948 as the symbolic birth of multicultural Britain, it's been a multicultural country for a very long time. And I think that our education needs to reflect that, not just in terms of sort of one day a year or one particular part of the curriculum, but throughout it to reflect the multicultural aspects and dimensions of this country. And going back to the point about history, I absolutely agree that, and as I've said, that means studying everything that you're proud of, but also the things that you'd rather sweep under the carpet. All of that needs to be discussed in the education system if we are going to become a country that is at ease with itself.
Sam Gyimah mentioning there Black History Month. There are lots of black people saying that they're not black for 1 month of the year, they're black for 12 months of the year. David Oyelowo, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the fact that, you know, for me, as someone born in the UK, I'm incredibly proud of my British heritage. A lot of us who are born in the UK, who identify as British, we are so proud of our heritage. And, you know, sometimes the notion is that to bring up, as Sam just mentioned there, some of the darker sides of whether it's British history or here in America, the history here, is to feel shame or to somehow denigrate that society or community. The fact of the matter is, I want to be proud of being British, and I want to be proud of the Britain that it wants to be going forward. we have all, as individuals, you know, the Bible says all have sinned and fallen short. We have all done things we're not proud of. That doesn't discount you. That doesn't write you off. That doesn't cancel you. So much of the beauty that happens within a person as they go forward into their life is an acceptance of what they did wrong and who they want to be and how transcendent they want to be going forward. Great Britain can actually earn that title going forward by accepting what it did in the past, acknowledging it, moving on from it, and having young people who are now going to be proud of the Britain we have going forward, as opposed to the Britain we had in the past. And I would say exactly the same thing here in America. That pride is part of what got us here in the first place, a sort of a communal national pride and ego that means that you have to subjugate other people in order to feel great yourself. And I think we're just better than that. And we as Black people, as brown people in America and the UK, we simply want to share in the pie we helped create. It's not about supremacy. It's not about revenge. It's just about sharing in what we helped build.
David Oyelowo, thank you very much. Just need a piece of that pie. Time to take a final question from our audience, this time from Curtis de Leon. Curtis, what's your question?
Good evening, panel. My question is, what next? Can racism ever be tackled without the active support of majority white people standing up and speaking out?
OK, let's put that final question to the panel. Karen Blackett, can racism really ever be tackled without the support of majority white people standing up and actually speaking out?
Look, in order to make a change, we need allies. It really is as simple as that. And if I think about my own world and the business world and the advertising industry and marketing communications, as I said earlier, less than 5% of senior leaders in my industry come from an ethnic minority background. So that minority cannot change everything for the majority. We just can't. So one thing which is really important is allyship. We need people to stand with us to help make that change. I have seen in the last few weeks my leaders at WPP get involved with more listening circles, be involved with more safe rooms that we've been running for our Black colleagues to hear for themselves what is happening, to hear the outpouring of grief. And they've been spurred into more action. There was always an underlying thought about more inclusiveness and making sure that we are open. But the last few weeks, because they've literally been spurred into action and heard it for themselves, a commitment to action and making change, real commitment to making change. And we are talking about allyship training, bystander training, to make sure that all of those everyday moments of, and I hate the term microaggression because they're not micro to the person on the end of them, but those everyday insidious incidents of racism and inequality, that the majority see them, understand them, hear them, and call it out. And so I genuinely believe that you do need allies, you do need the majority to make the change, because this is not a Black issue, it's a social issue, it's an issue that affects all of society.
Karen,
it can't just be left to one sector to
on
solve
that
it.
On that point where we're looking for solutions, give us your one solution aside from allyship.
Look, the leaders, check your circle. It's something that June Sarpong said in her brilliant book, Diversify. Check your circle. Who are the closest 4 people that you go to at work when you want to have a sounding board, when you want to get advice, when you want to talk about what went right or what went wrong? Who are those 4 people? If those 4 people are very similar to you in terms of background, in terms of social class, in terms of education, in terms of race, then you're not doing anything to help create more inclusion and more diversity. Check your circle and make a difference so that you have more diversity of thought.
Thank you. Check your circle. Professor Olusoga, what would your solution be?
Well, the thing I would have asked even before the murder of George Floyd is amazingly what's happening, which is learning and listening. The reading lists being passed around online, the huge sales. Reni Oyelowo's book is top of the charts today, the most bought book in Britain. I would have dreamed just a few weeks ago that all people of all backgrounds would be willing to read about racism, how it works systemically, read about Black history, and incredibly, that appears to be what's happening on a scale I couldn't imagine. But I think it's happening actually because of the big issue here, which is this is generational change. Who was it who brought down the statue of Colston? It was the young. Who are reading and buying these books? It's the young. Who has decided that they don't really want to live in this system, whether they're Black or white? They don't want to participate in this system or benefit from it, never mind suffer from it.
Just going to jump in there. Just going to jump in there so we can get two more solutions. First from David Oyelowo.
Well, like I've said before, we are dealing with systems of oppression. They have been designed and they have been built, and they were not built by Black people. They were built by white people. People balk at that. And it's not that you're saying to every white person alive now that you built it, but you benefit from it. And what we are saying is that you have to acknowledge that, accept that, because the reason it was built was to harness power. What we are now asking as Black people is for you to cede power, to share power, to allow us in, whether it's my industry or any of the political arena, the advertising arena, the sports arena, allow us to share. And that is part of what is going to enable us to move forward together. It all ties back to education. You have to accept that there are certain constructs, whether it's the class system in the UK, whether it's colonialism, whether it's apartheid, whether it's enslaved people, there are racist containers that we've all been living in that need to be dismantled in order for us to build something new. The only way we do that is... I'm
so sorry, we are running out of time rapidly. Thank you very much for that. And thank you to our audience for their questions and stories. Your contribution was invaluable. Great to have you with us. Thanks especially to our panellists tonight, David Oyelowo, Karen Blackett, Professor Olusoga and Sam Gyimah. Thank you all. So what have we learnt this evening? Well, we've heard how deeply racism still exists, but we've also heard ideas on how to put that right, including more and better community policing. Thank you for watching. Good night.